Panel, if you would like to come on camera, I am going to introduce you now. Our first keynote speaker is Jennifer Argross. She is the University of Arizona Cooperative Extensions Program Director for the Family Resource Center in Santa Cruz County. She manages 3 centers with 6 full-time staff and 18 part-time. She develops curriculum for the center, which includes more than 20 lesson plans, such as Partners in Parenting Education and Positive Discipline, Kindergarten Readiness, and Keys for 3 classes. She serves as the liaison between the Family Resource Center staff, local school districts, and the Norton School of Family and Consumer Sciences evaluation team. She has an amazing biography, and we are so happy that you're here with us today, Jennifer, so thank you. Our next presenter is Tammy Clark. She has an MED and has been in the field of early childhood education for over 10 years in various roles. Currently, she serves as the Child Development Center Director, and her role, she supports the program, which is dedicated to assisting families in transforming their lives as survivors of domestic violence and sex trafficking. The high-quality program uses a Reggio-inspired approach with a strong emphasis on trauma-informed care within her center. Kamaie, thank you so much for being here. We're so excited to have you. Camille Latcher is our next keynote on the panel. She holds several part-time positions, including adjunct faculty in the Early Childhood Department at University of Arizona Global Campus, Central Arizona College, and the City University of New York School of Professional Studies, as well as working for the Blake Foundation as an education coordinator. She supports the 2 learning centers through the NAEYC accreditation process, and she has presented for us many times. Camille, welcome. Thank you. Kelly is last on the panel. Thank you for being here. She has spent over 30 years working with young children, families, and educators. She holds a BS in Child Development and Family Relations from the University of Maine. And she currently works as an executive director of the Southern Arizona Association for the Education of Young Children. And she has an MA in teacher and teacher education with early childhood emphasis. This panel has amazing experience, and I know what they share with us today is going to be incredible. Ladies, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I guess I'm speaking first. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Shipley and Dr. Hale for inviting us. We're very excited about presenting this information to you all. And yeah, so here I guess we'll just get started. So here we are. So you know who I am. I think that we don't have to talk much here because I think you did a great job introducing all of us. So I guess we could just all say hi, and it's okay if we skip over this slide, right? Panel, thumbs up, everyone. Yeah. Okay, good. So if you all can please in the chat, if you could just put your name and your position, where you're from and why you're here, because I know that there have been so many phenomenal topics that have been covered with activity ideas and, take home bags and all this great stuff. And we're talking about, like position statements and nothing really. Well, to us, it's exciting, but maybe it might not sound all that exciting to you. So why are you here? And what made you decide to come to our session? You could just take a few minutes, and I guess who's reading what's in the chat? Somebody? My whole panel, you're all muted. Okay,
Andrew from Nevada. Everyone's sending lots of love, and I've shared my email address, Bridget. Love to hear from her. Michelle from UAGC's core faculty, happy to have you. Lots of Annie
people from everywhere, right?
Yeah, paraprofessional. You're the true hero. Public school, first grade, love it. We got Jen, Denise, Maxwell, lead faculty, a lot of faculty. Anna, education coordinator from Los Angeles, California, my home state.
All right. So we really appreciate everyone being here. We have a lot of passion around this topic. We've presented this a few times now, and I think every time we present it, we reflect, and hopefully the information that we give you will help you to reflect on our work with young children and families, and your own voices and your own stories, and how important that is to the field. So we're going to start off with Kelly, and Kelly's going to give us a little history on the developmentally appropriate practices statement. So, good.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Kelly Larkin. I am here in Tucson, Arizona, so the southern part of the state. And one thing that I'm not sure that we put in our bios is the four of us are connected through our AUIC work. So Jennifer and I both serve on the Southern Arizona board, and Kamaie and Camille serve on the Arizona board. So here in the state of Arizona, we have two affiliates that are affiliated with the National Association for the Education of Young Children. So as we've restructured and as NACE has come up with new position statements, we really, I think, found this like niche in having a conversation about the history of DAP and how it ties into our equity work. And so just a little I don't want to spend a lot of time, but just some like context behind this is that for those of you that are not familiar, NACE came out with its first position statement in about the mid 80s. I feel like I was very young and vibrant back then in high school and college. And some of the things that they were seeing is there was this increase in preschool or pre-kindergarten programs, and there was this like shoving down of content and information. And so they really came out with this idea of like what is appropriate for young children. And so they had to kind of develop this idea of what was developmentally appropriate. And they based that a lot on child development, on their guidelines, on criterion of developmental milestones. And it really focused on 4 and 5-year-olds. And then you can go to the next slide, Camille. And then as it expanded, and there's been a few iterations of it, it started to look at birth through children age 8. And so I remember the first statement, it had this very like black and white thing, like do this, but not that. And so I think one thing as the years have gone on and we become more evidence-based, learning more research about how brains develop, how children go through milestones, is that we have to do what's best for children based on their social and cultural context, the programs that they're in. And so there also had to be some consensus. What I think might be best practices may not be what Camille think is best practices. And that really comes to the context and the programs that we work in. And so this idea of reframing best practices and turning it into this idea of quality practices. And so if you look at the newer version of developmentally appropriate practice, and we will put the links in the chat so that people have them, we're kind of shifting away from this idea of best and looking at quality. And quality practices are informed by evidence, they're informed by research, professional judgment, and they try to align with the standards and competencies that NACE has put out for us as professionals. And then the other thing that we know is when DAP kind of was first introduced to us in the 80s, it was really based on this white upper middle class view of programs that children were in and what they should learn and what was provided to them. And so that impacts our work in different ways, because what we really have to look at is the context of who children are, where their families are, what kind of backgrounds are they coming from. And so I think if I think about myself and I think about how I was years ago, my view was very limited on my Northern Vermont upbringing with my University of Maine program. And then as I moved to Boston, I learned more from being in a parochial school where 38 nations were represented. So I really had to start shifting my ideas and my thoughts and listening to families and being in partnership with them to look at what their culture was. And so I think one of the highlights of the new DAP statement is this idea of this 3 core considerations. And we look at the commonality. So where is that research? How do we understand child development? How do we understand what children learn? We know so much more about brain development now than we did 40 years ago, so that impacts our work. Then individuality is the second core consideration. We really need to look at each child. And so each child within themselves, within their families, within our programs, and then the context. So the social and cultural context that we're all part of, right? And so we're part of there are children in our programs, there's educators, there's programs, and there's families. And so then with that, in recent years, so not only did NACCE really revise and look at their developmentally appropriate practice statement, but as those conversations happen, and for those of you that maybe were part of national conversations, either at the annual conference or PLI or by surveys you received, they had to start looking at this from an equity lens. And so I'll be honest, I always hesitate when I start talking about equity because I am sitting here today in Tucson speaking from you with really like a middle white woman's background. And I'm so blessed to have worked with children and families from really a variety of programs that have helped me to inform my work. I'm blessed to have colleagues that have been brave to have conversations with me. And so as I've learned more, this really impacts our work, but we really have to look at this idea of equity. And so what we know is that there are differences in social and cultural contexts. And so looking at these things may often be used as a deficit or a gap, and how are we using the social and cultural context of families as a strength to support our program and support children. They revised DAP and the equity kind of, I would say, in tandem. So they came out in similar years, and we really can't have one conversation with the other. So we have to really acknowledge that the critical role that our cultural and social contexts, how they impact our work. And really we have to be brave and have the conversations about maybe some implicit or explicit bias that we come to the table with as we're educators, or that we're working with children or with colleagues.
Okay, thanks, Kelly.
You're welcome.
So I'm going to speak now about the NEYC foundational documents, and I'm going to go over 5 of them. Kelly already spoke to the developmentally appropriate practices statement, but what I do want to say is if anybody has any questions while we're speaking, please just put them in the chat because we will address them as we go along, and at the end we are going to save time to address any additional questions you may have. The link to all of these statements also will be put in the chat, so you'll have access to them. So NEYC has what they call their 5 foundational documents. 4 of them actually have the title of position statements. The NEYC Early Childhood Program Standards is part of the accreditation process. And the way they developed these foundational documents was that they created a work group. This work group, created a document, and then they put it out for public comment. Kelly spoke a little bit about that. And this process, they would get the information back. They would put it out to people who are members. They put it out to the field because they know that we are the experts, right? We're the ones working with the kids. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to get some feedback on the documents that they've created. And this was like a back and forth system. Like I said, there was a work group, they put it out for public comment, they received the comments back, they revised their documents, put it out again. And I want to say the one that took the longest was the professional standards and competencies for early childhood education. I think there were 8 or 10 back and forth discussions around that, because what they're trying to do here is make a national standard. And I'm going to tell you right now, the qualifications for a teacher in Arizona are very different than the qualifications in the state where I am from, which is in New York. And it looks very different. So to get everyone on the same page, with that, I think was very, very difficult. But the professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators is pretty much about what we early childhood educators need to know to provide every child with a high quality learning environment. And so this statement has a core body of knowledge, their skills, there's values, dispositions, that what we need to know in order for every child to have equitable services, right? And so again, if here in Arizona, a teacher has to breathe and they're qualified to be a teacher in a preschool classroom, looks very different, and the care that child in that program is going to look very different than a preschool teacher in New York. So that's the first document. The next one is the Code of Ethical Conduct. And so here, these are the guidelines for our responsible behavior, right? We face ethical decisions every day. I feel like every decision is like an ethical decision in this field. And I've been in this field for 30 some odd years. And, it's not like, what pictures am I going to put on the door to decorate the door? But, oh boy, the kid who's not allowed to have meat just had, the kid's meatball on the other plate. And do I tell the parent? And, we are faced with those decisions. So this is a guide. It's not going to give you the answers. It's just a point of reference to help us make these ethical decisions. The Code of Ethical Conduct includes principles and ideals, and it's divided into responsibilities to children, to families, to colleagues, and to the community and society. And then they created an additional document for educators. So that's that document. Advancing equity in early childhood is exactly what Kelly spoke about. That document is the most recent, came together with the developmentally appropriate practices, newly revised. And you can't have one without the other. There's a lot of crossover. Jen is going to speak to that a little bit later, but this document addresses the equity, the diversity, the inclusion, and principles pretty much being fair and being just to all children and families that we work with. And then the NAEYC Early Childhood Program Standards. So those are the standards that frame NAEYC accreditation of early learning programs. And so there are 10 standards. And if anybody is familiar with the accreditation process, it's, I don't want to say it's similar to a quality rating and improvement system that the states have, although a lot of states developed their QRIS, competencies around the early childhood standards from NAEYC. They're somewhat similar, but they're very different. And so that's what that statement includes. And those are the program standards that are looked at, I guess, to provide high quality services to the children and families. So with that, we're going to have Kamaie speak a little bit about the Code of Ethics.
Hi, I'm Tammy Clark. Thank you for having me today. I'm so excited to share some information with you today about the equity statement that we're going to be speaking on today. So we know, just like Camille mentioned, every day we are pretty much faced with ethical dilemmas. I don't know of anyone who works in the field who hasn't come in contact with a situation where there just wasn't a right answer or a wrong answer. And so we're going to look at a case study today and just get some food for thought and get our wheels spinning and thinking about these different situations and how we may be able to better come to terms with how we can face these ethical dilemmas. So next slide, Camille. So we're going to hear about a little boy. His name is Damien. Damien's 4 years old, and he's a 4-year-old Black boy. He attends a community-based preschool. He's physically large and tends to be aggressive at times. This may be familiar. You may have heard of someone, or you may have had someone who's like Damien. his teacher. She's a middle-aged white woman, and she's been teaching for 20 years. So tons of experience, may not quite understand why some of her strategies and techniques are not working with Damien. So she calls in the specialist. This is a mental health consultant. The mental health consultant does some observations and offers some suggestions, none of which have worked. And so the teacher and her assistant are just at their wits' end, and they are tired, and they are suggesting that Damien be expelled. His parents, frustrated, upset, and they feel as though he is having more expectations because he is Black and because he's larger. They feel he's being followed more closely, and he's expected, and they're expecting him to have these challenging behaviors. And so when I think about this dilemma, one that I've faced myself, one that I've seen faced, prior to my position, I was a professional development coach. And so I worked with a lot of teachers who would encounter those children who are just a little bit challenging. It's not one that is uncommon. A lot of times I find myself in a position where I'd have to pose questions to just get their thinking into another mind frame. And so I'm going to pose a few rhetorical questions. You can write these down or just think about how you would answer them as in your position. And so some of the questions I might ask this teacher are, what steps have you taken to increase Damien's self-awareness? Is he aware that he is as large as he is? Is he given the opportunity to express himself in and outside of the classroom? How are Damien's traits being highlighted and celebrated in the classroom? Does he see himself reflected in the books and the postings that you have up in the classroom? Is he maybe picking up on the fact that you're following him closely in anticipation for his negative behaviors? Another question I might ask is, how has there been an attempt to self-reflect yourself to ensure that Damien is receiving an equitable opportunity? Even in the position statement, it speaks about individuals having the capacity to self-reflect, and it challenges educators to disrupt their existing systems of privilege. And so those are some questions that I would pose. I would also want to know about Damien's parents. They feel that he's being targeted. Have those feelings been addressed? Have you partnered with the family to find out more information about their feelings and what their experiences have been? Are you collaborating with them to help address his behaviors? Another point I want to make is that the mental health consultant, she came in and she observed and she provided some suggestions, none of which worked. But in an article that I read, it was titled "Disrupting the Preschool Prison to Pipeline Frequency and Intensity" were two major concepts that were highlighted. And so did that consultant come in and did she understand Damien's background and his culture and where he was from, and what was his birth order? What is his home life like? What was the intensity and the frequency of that person that they had to come in to offer those suggestions? Those would be the questions that I would pose. Go to the next slide. So we're going to touch on a pretty heavy topic, and that's historical trauma. And I'm not going to attempt to try to come up with all the answers today, because this in and of itself could be an entire presentation. But I just want to address the why it's important for educators to understand historical trauma, and the what behind historical trauma. So historical trauma is that members of a historically oppressed group may have had negative impacts. That's on their physical, on their social, and on their emotional health and well-being. And that's not to exclude self-destructive behaviors. And we see that in things that we read. We know that Black, Brown, and Indigenous families are at higher risk for chronic and terminal illnesses. This is something that we know. And so obviously, coming with my domestic violence background, working in a shelter, I see it every day firsthand. I see how trauma really manifests itself. And although there's no evidence that directly links trauma to historical trauma, the fact still remains that unaddressed grief and Behavioral health, the need for behavioral health when there's absence, it in the community, it exacerbates this situation right here. And so it's really important for us to recognize and to be aware, to have a heightened awareness. We can't have the answers to all of this, but we can definitely be aware that these things are real and they truly do exist. Personally, in my family, we kind of consider these things, we call them in my family generational curses. And so we actively, in my family, we actively work to break generational curses by addressing our mental health, by working out, by taking bi-yearly family vacations, things like that, placing emphasis on higher education. My parents didn't go to college. And then when my generation came along, it was, are you gonna go to college? And now my daughter, she's 6 years old, and she's like, when I go to college, it's not if or can I, it's where are you going? And she's 6 years old, and she's like, I'm going to UCLA, and I'm going to excel in gymnastics. And the narrative has shifted in my family. And so we feel as though like we have really worked towards breaking generational curses. And I feel like generational curses really is related to what would be historical trauma. I'm very fortunate. I've had some opportunities that I know everyone is not afforded with, but it's definitely, I just definitely feel very fortunate, and not everyone has those same opportunities. And it's our duty as educators to recognize that and to help shift that and to help meet the needs of the families that are in our classrooms. I also want to talk about why it's important for us to understand that. I think it highlights the fact that we have to approach early education. It magnifies the idea that we should approach education from a holistic approach. We cannot simply say, how do I fix this child? But understanding his background and his family, it helps to disrupt those systems. Recognizing historical trauma helps us to be better prepared to meet the needs of the individual family and the individual child, as opposed to why is he behaving this way? What happened to him? We have to shift our mindsets. And so although it's difficult to think about intervention with this when we're talking about this topic, because it's connected to so much pain and so much wrongdoing. But the topic itself, it's raw, it's controversial, and it's uncomfortable. It's just an uncomfortable conversation. Just the picture alone kind of made me cringe and just have this gut feeling of pain and hurt connected to it. But researchers place a lot of emphasis on the healing process. So if we think more about the healing process and less about these issues, I think it will begin to help us to have a little more empathy for the families and the children that we're working with in our classroom. The NACCE position statement on equity, I believe that's a great start. And I believe that the process of applying those 6 recommendations in there that are placed for everyone, it talks about building awareness. It talks about recognizing diversity, and in my opinion, celebrating, not just recognizing diversity, but celebrating diversity, taking responsibility for bias actions, because those are going to happen. It's human nature, but recognizing and making that shift, acknowledgement, commitment, and recognizing that the shift of professional knowledge is changing. It's no longer just coming from a white middle class standpoint, but that I have value to add, you have value to add. The families in your classroom who have zero education have knowledge that is valuable to the children that are in your classroom. Next slide, Camille.
So I just want to say that was a lot of information that Kamaie just gave us, with a lot of things to think about. This is not planned. I just have to say that I think that all of the people that are out there that say, oh, this happened such a long time ago, get over it. You can't. You just can't get over it. And it is hard. It is hard to talk about it. It is hard to think about it, but it is what happened. And so I think, just like Kamaie said, you can't understand the child unless you know where they come from. And they come from a family, and you have to know that family's history in order to help them and serve them. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. Sorry.
No, it's okay, Camille. And I like I said, I tried to condense that, but that is a topic that we can have an entire presentation on its own. So it's hard to fit all of that in one slide. So definitely it's something, it's an ongoing conversation. So the terms we're going to speak about today, they are all included in the equity statement. We've included just little visuals. And what I did was, as opposed to simply defining these terms, I thought it would be useful to connect the terms to one of the recommendations in the equity statement. And so because I'm assuming, and I'm hoping I'm not making a silly assumption, but that you've all either have familiarized yourself with these terms, or you've heard them before, you've used them in your practices. And so the first one is inclusion. And we know that inclusion is the desired results of inclusive experiences for children. And the recommendation we have there is it's a recommendation for early childhood educators, and that's to just recognize and be prepared to provide different levels of support. It's so interesting when my teachers come to me and they say, I don't know why he's behaving this way. I treat everyone the same. And I say, this teacher specifically, she has a daughter that's 10 months and a daughter that's 10 years old. And I said, well, do you treat your baby the same way you treat your child in school age? No, you're going to give them what they need. So you're going to differentiate the services that you're providing to the children. So that's what we want to do with inclusion. And the next term we have here is equity. The whole reason that we are here and speaking to you is just to really provide some equitable opportunities for the children and the families in the classroom and give them the necessary support and services that they need. The recommendation is for administrators for schools, and that's to establish a collaborative relationship with other social service agencies and providers within the community. And so if you have a child in your care who's needing services that you cannot provide, that's no reason to send them away, but that it's a great opportunity to build a collaborative relationship and invite them into your schools and into your centers to fill the gap and to help meet the needs of those kids and their families. The next term we have here is oppression. And oppression is just the systematic and prolonged mistreatment of a group of people. And the recommendation we have here are for public policymakers to use an equity lens when they're considering policies and the impacts on their children and the bond that they're breaking between their families. And so oppression is something that we are actively fighting to help change the course. We have a long way to go, but I do not want to go without recognizing the long way that we've come. So let's continue our work in that. And it starts with the early educators. I feel like we're the superheroes and the leaders in fighting against oppression. And this next term is actually one that was very new to me. I wasn't very familiar with white fragility. I was like, that's a term that I've never heard. And I started doing a little bit of research on it. And what is that? And what is this, what is this word? Because I'm very more familiar with white privilege. But white fragility, it talks about social environment and how it protects white people from race-based stress. It talks about in the equity statement how even small amounts of racial stress can be intolerable to white people, and that can trigger defense action. And then I started to think try to think of an example of how this happened. And I thought about when my daughter was 2 years old and she was starting to recognize differences. Children in her classroom were recognizing that she was different. She went to predominantly white preschool, and we were at a birthday party, and the mother mentioned something about, oh, they play so well together. And I mentioned, actually my daughter is recognizing differences and things have been said to her. And she's come back and she's told me, she must have been 3 years old because she already had a lot of language, and she was telling me about the different things that people were saying. Her skin was brown, her hair was different. She wanted to, and the mother, her body language, she got so uncomfortable, and she was on the defense. My daughter, we don't teach color at all. And she quickly changed that subject back to how much fun those children were having at the party. And that, to me, was a great illustration of white fragility. She was not in a space where she wanted to address and or talk about it. And so the recommendation we have here are for those who are facilitating educators, who are the ones who are providing that professional development, is to prepare those prospective childhood educators to meet the professional standard and competency, and to prepare them to and be ready to have uncomfortable conversations in these conferences and be prepared for these situations to come up in the classrooms. And so the recommendation are for those facilitating professional development to prepare these teachers so that they do not go in uncomfortable and unready and unwilling to have those really hard, difficult conversations.
Okay. Now we're going to move on to Jennifer, and she's going to go over the overlap in the recommendations. Okay, Jen.
So many of us in the early childhood field, we get fired up when we hear about all this stuff, and we think about early childhood and we look at our daily work and we think, of course, we want these developmentally appropriate practices. You know, of course, I want to ensure that all those working directly with children in early childhood settings from birth through age 8 have equitable, affordable access to high quality professional development preparation required to meet the standards and competencies at all professional designations. We all want that. We know that that's the best practice, but sometimes it's hard to see the path there, that we're looking at the reality. I'm a director and I'm looking at my staff and I'm seeing all the obstacles and barriers there are to actually getting my staff there. And so we wanted to kind of design this crosswalk that showed you how advancing equity in early childhood really directly relates to the developmentally appropriate practice. And so you can think of the advancing equity in early childhood education as maybe the action steps that we're taking to really promote the field. And if you have in any of these situations, if you're in the classroom or if you are a director and you're looking at the developmentally appropriate practices and maybe you're thinking like, is this a wish list? Is this like, because this isn't maybe what you're able to have in your current situation, this is the advancing equity in early childhood education could really, really help all of us in looking at what we can do to make sure that all children are getting the best that we can give. So we're preparing prospective early childhood educators to meet professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators. We're working with students and community leaders and public officials to address barriers. We're implementing transfer and articulating policies that recognize and award credits for students' previous early childhood courses and degrees, as well as demonstrating competencies through prior work. So that's the work that we're doing outside of the classroom to support the whole field to get so that everybody can be doing the best that we can for children. So again, here we have providing adequate funding to ensure that all children have equitable access to high quality early learning programs. I'm not going to read the whole thing right there. When the first sentence, provide adequate funding. How many of us are just like, what? Like, show me the money. Like, why are we not doing this? So these are the action steps. You know, over here, it's you know, we need to be increased financing for high quality early learning services. We need to ensure sufficient funding for access and supports. We need to establish comparable compensation. You know, this is a huge one. Comparable compensation. You know, that if you're hearing this and you're saying, what? Then this is your opportunity. We're going to walk you through some great advocacy steps and show you how everybody has a voice and everybody can promote when we all have the same rhetoric happening. I think there's one more maybe. Recognize the limitations of accountability systems that narrowly focus on skill-based assessments and revise policies accordingly. Again, like you read it and it's just like, what? Because we all know that there's those assessments that aren't accommodating everybody. They're really, you know, have a narrow focus. And so we can make policies that promote the use of authentic assessments and that are developmentally, culturally and linguistically appropriate. We can revise early learning standards to ensure that they reflect the cultural diverse settings which educators practice. So this is the crosswalk. This is where you can see that the advancing equity in education statements really support the work that you're doing in the classroom.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so now Jennifer did mention that we're going to give you some a little
There was
bit.
one more.
Oh, wait, there was?
Okay, just keep going. I want to leave room for them to do the activity.
Oh no, go ahead, go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm
This
sorry.
This was the promoted equity and learning opportunities for all young children, and recognizing the need for comprehensive services. You know, Kamaie she was so spot on when she's saying you have to look at the whole family. And Camille, you have to look at the whole family. You know, you're not educating just this one child. You know, he's bringing his whole life experience, his parents' experience, his grandparents' experience into the classroom with him. And so in order to do that, we have to talk about toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences. We need to promote national, state, and local policies that promote and support bilingualism for all children, and set goals of reducing U.S. child poverty rate by half within a decade. Can you imagine, like, oh.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, so here we go. We're going to do some story sharing. And I think it's really important to first mention that the advancing equity statement, the developmentally appropriate practices statement, it's all really important to those of us who are working directly with children, right? It's really important because the people who are in the trenches and working every single day, you're making an impact directly on the children, and these statements will inform your work. But it's important for those of us who are not in a classroom to also look at these statements and really like digest the information, because we're advocates. Everyone is everybody here is an advocate. And whether you understand it, you don't understand it, you appreciate it, you think you have a story, you think you don't have a story, every single person who is here today has a story, and every single story is different, and every single story is important, every single one. And if everybody who works in this field went to their politicians and told their politicians their story, these politicians would be hearing a million different stories, and no two are the same. And so I just wanted to start off with that, because I think sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit for all the information we have. You know, it's not just about textbook information. Yeah, of course, you could pull data, and we're going to give you some data, but it's also really important to know that your own personal experiences are very, very valuable. And so this little slide here, Kamaie and I are going to share personal stories. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? Me? You?
Go ahead.
Me? Okay. So this is the framework, and I'll read it to you like a story. Although speaking to a politician, I would not say once upon a time, although sometimes I think the politicians need to hear once upon a time. So once upon a time, I moved from New York, where I lived like my entire life, and I moved to Arizona. And I got a job working as an education coordinator, helping programs go through the NEYC accreditation process. And every day I would visit 2 early learning centers in particular. I would go alternate days. So every day I'd be in a center. And one day I was in a program that had a child who has had an IEP. The child was autistic, and the child, because of the IEP, had a one-on-one aid. And I saw that one-on-one aid be very inappropriate with this child, threatening him pretty much. And the early childhood educator that I am, and of course I know I'm a mandated reporter, I saw red, and I went to the director. And so because of that, what I saw, I went to the director and I said, get her out of the classroom. And if you don't, I'm going to call CPS. And that's exactly what I said. And she explained to me that that was the one-on-one aid, and she's not part of the staff. And so I'm coming from a lens of being a facilitator of any EOIC accreditation, besides being an early childhood professional. And I said, well, first of all, it doesn't matter who she is. She's not appropriate. She's threatening the child. And anyway, what kind of education does she have? Like, didn't she know? With that, the director said to me, oh, she just needs a high school diploma. You don't need any kind of formal education to be a one-on-one aide. Because of that, I reached out to colleagues and asked if that information was true. Sadly, it was. And so because of that, I ended up joining the Council for Exceptional Children and the Division of Early Childhood, and got involved with the Arizona DEC. And I ended up taking classes to become an advocate for special education. I am not a special education person at all. That's not what I'm trained in. Early childhood, not special education. But now I am, because I learned a lot. And finally, I participated in Special Education Day at the Capitol, where I got to speak, and I was the only one in my group that spoke to early childhood special education. But I spoke, and I spoke to them, and we had meetings with two different members of legislation, and I told this story and why this experience for me was so important, that they should know it, because funding has to be given to our state at least, and I'm sure it's everywhere, to educate people. You just can't breathe and be a one-on-one aide. I mean, it's just not going to cut it. And that was a disservice to that child, a disservice to that family. And so that's my elevator speech. And Kamaie, you're up.
Okay, so once upon a time, I was an early childhood teacher. It was my first time. I'd been teaching preschool for many, many years, and I decided to move over into the toddler classroom and start teaching as an early childhood Head Start teacher. Every day I had a student, and every day that child would come in with a bleeding diaper rash that would just mortify me. And so one day I was at my wit's end, and I broke down crying, and I called my professional development coach, and I told her, I need to call DCS right now. This child is being neglected and she is not being cared for properly. And my coach talked me down, and she told me, we are the buffer between in the classroom and in DCS, and I want you to speak with that family about reasons why this child has a bleeding diaper rash. And I was a little reluctant, because this family did not speak English, and I had to use a translator. And come to find out, this child was being changed by a grandma who did not have very great vision and was wiping the wrong way. And so we provided a different type of diaper. We provided a different type of wipes for the child, as well as we provided the grandmother with information on how to properly wipe. After that, her diaper rash stopped bleeding. She stopped having diaper rashes. And because of that, I understood the importance of family collaboration. I understood the importance of professional development, and because of that, I pursued my master's in early childhood education, and myself became a professional development coach. And I now understand more of why we need to be training our teachers. And this is why we need to redirect our funding towards professional development and early childhood education. And it's important that you understand that it starts early. And that's my story.
Okay, and think that by sharing both our stories, which are just stories, but it's stories from our experience, anybody and everybody can do it. So with a story, it's always helpful to have some data. So we're going to go on to the next slide, and Kelly's going to share some national data that we have. Okay, Kelly.
Okay, and so I did put in the chat. So here in Arizona, we've done a couple of public policy days, both at the state level and the local level. And so we use that storyline to kind of empower educators and parents and families to tell their story. So it's based on the Pixar model. So we did put a link in the chat for those of you that want to look at that. And then as you do it, you're going to like look at your audience, right? So you might not start with once upon a time, but it's a good way to practice what you want to say and get that pitch. So as you're talking to people and educating them, you can hopefully change minds. And so we are going to give some national data. This does come from NACI, and they did a recent survey of about, I think, almost close to 10,000 educators across the country took the survey this July. And we feel like this information will be really helpful for you. We know that there's a lot of funding coming from the federal government. We know there's been a lot of conversation about this childcare crisis and what's going to happen. For most of us, it's nothing new. The day has just finally come, is what I keep saying. We knew this day was going to come. We just weren't quite sure when. But from the survey, what we have found out is that 80% of people who took the survey have a staffing shortage, and that means 1 to 5 openings in their centers. We also know that 50% of them have been impacted by staffing. So I know here in Arizona, our number might be a little bit lower, but it's still pretty on target with what the national average is showing. We have programs that have wait lists, or they're unable to open classrooms because we don't have the staff to do the work. We have programs who have reduced their operating hours. And then what we also know is that 70% of those who have been in the field for 1 year or less are saying they're unsure of what's going to happen. They're unsure of will there be a pipeline of people choosing to go into this workforce to do the work. And then out of that 70%, 55% of minority owned businesses say the same thing. And so we will also put the link in the chat because I think this information is important. I was recently home back east in Vermont, and I heard someone talking about the child tax credit, the $300 per child. And I quickly flew on the offense and said, you do realize that that's a fraction of what it costs for high quality care. So I know for my niece and nephew, I think my brother and his ex-wife get about $600. And what we know is that even aftercare that's barely going to cover aftercare for them. So if you were to send 2 children at $1,000 a month for childcare so that you can be part of this robust economy that we're hoping to have, that is just pennies to what it really costs to support high quality care. And Camille, I think you can go to the next slide.
Right. Okay. Okay, so me, I guess.
I think just a bunch of resources and times for questions.
Yeah, so what we did was we have a couple of slides that have several resources, the developmentally appropriate practice statement, all the statements that we already put into the chat, the Administration for Children and Families, which is another fabulous resource, national organizations and that do offer advocacy efforts. So here are some of those national organizations, and these are advocacy efforts that we do in Arizona here. So the Children's Action Alliance, Child Care Aware, the childcare aware find your legislator, I think that's a national, like anybody can use this link. And Kelly found this link and it's like her favorite link in the whole wide world, because all you have to do is like put in your address and it tells you everyone from your local person to the president. So it's go ahead,
Yes.
Kelly.
So
Right.
sorry to interrupt. I actually just put in a link. And please, for those of you that remember that are feeling inspired and empowered, our elected officials are currently on recess. So many of them are home. They're in your local offices. They're in your states. And so try to connect, because I think the other thing to remember when we talk about the story, when they are making voting decisions and they can put a face to that story, and they can remember your story or your child's story or a program story, that is going to help influence their decision. And the more we can put real people to the crisis situation that's happened and use this equity lens to really support high quality care for all children in the country, that's what's going to make the difference. So yes, that is like one of my favorite links. Sorry for my long-winded answer.
Yeah, I would just add too that, you might, look at the story template and you might feel intimidated. Maybe you don't want to go, visit your legislator, but there's still work you can do. You can talk to your neighbors. You can talk to the Chamber of Commerce in your local town. You can talk to the city council, the supervisors. There's more, if you don't feel like, it is intimidating, you think, oh, I don't want to talk to a senator, but, even if you talk to your HOA, like it's everybody's issue, childcare and early childhood education. You never know what, who's going to hear your story and take it. Maybe you share it with your neighbor, but that neighbor is going to the city council meeting and says, oh, well, this was what happened to my neighbor. You just never know who your story is going to impact.
And I can tell you that what we're in the process of trying to do is, now that they are back here and they're all back home, we're trying to set up appointments where these legislators could come in and tour a center and see, look at what we're doing on the little bit of money that you give us. And so it's very it's important and it's powerful. It really is powerful. More advocacy opportunities. NAEYC has a public policy forum. We do 2 of them here in Arizona, and they're usually in the beginning of March. And if you're interested in your state affiliate of NAEYC, you should just check out, I don't know if we put the link in there to the state affiliates. You should find your state affiliates, see what they're doing. They'll be happy to share information, whether they're, whether you're a member or not. I mean, they're always a good resource. And so that's that slide. Here's all of our information if anybody would like it or has any questions, and questions in the chat. And then we have our thank you slide. I could stop sharing now, or I could keep sharing.